Hello. Here we are doing the presentation. We had another video, but it got lost in Caitlin's laptop. So we're doing secular music in slave life. And go.
Here you go.
Are you ready?
Okay. So, although the slaves, during their abductions from their homelands, had to leave their own instruments behind, and all their musical traditions, new instruments were brought from different countries, such as the bagpipes from Scotland, which that happened in 1735. Violins or fiddles were introduced by a Moravian immigrant, and 14 different drums were imported.
And one of these 14 drums is the Akan drum. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. And this is from West Africa, and it was discovered in the colony of Virginia, so that's how we know that this was during slave times. And it's been thought that because, like Caitlin said, the slaves weren't able to bring anything of their own onto the ship, a son of an African chief or maybe crew member of the ship brought it on, and they also used it in a form of exercise for the slaves, and they also called it dancing the slaves. And so they used that drum, and that's how it was brought into. So other drums, I'm sure, were brought onto our soil.
Yes. Awesome. Okay, so plantation life, it was interesting because slaves who played instruments they definitely held a higher status than those who just worked in the fields and all of that. Usually masters they preferred the fiddle, and so the slaves would learn to play the fiddle. They chose that mainly because it was small to carry. So any time that the masters would call upon their slaves for entertainment, they would do that for their guests and for their family.
Yeah, so like the fiddle, there were other instruments that the slaves had access to, like the guitar, the zither, harp-like instruments, bagpipes, reeds, horn, trumpet, rattles, bells, keyboards, flutes, and of course, strong emphasis in drums. And so they used that in many ways. I can't remember if this is me or you. It's you.
Oh, yeah. So in New Orleans, this was right before the major ban happened with music and everything. New Orleans in 1800, it was, I believe, what they could describe as a diverse stew pot. There were several different kinds of people that had immigrated to New Orleans, such as the Africans, English, French, German, Irish, Spanish, and so it was cool that on Sunday afternoons, slaves were allowed to hold these events called ring dances, and it was all about dancing around, music. And that happened, like I said, on Sunday afternoons. About 500 to 3,000 slaves were involved. They said about 6 different tribes were involved in this every Sunday. And the instruments they would use would be drums, of course, banjos, and rattles. But the ring dances were banned in 1843 by city officials. And after that ban had happened, blacks were then divided between those who could perform in public, and they would only perform what was considered cultured music, and those who performed African drumming underground.
Yes, and this leads us to drumming in general. Yeah, so when that was banned, and before this was banned, just drumming in itself, coming from Africa, was so close to the slaves, and they felt that they could communicate with the drumming amongst themselves, and definitely so the whites couldn't understand what they were saying, and they really used that against the whites. And especially after the ban of the ring dances, these underground drummings would happen, but eventually the whites and the masters caught on and banned drums as well from slaves, and took those all away, and they were left with still this dying need for producing the music and, creating the music of their continent, their homeland. And so that urge led them to find other means of drumming and finding different instruments. So they would use whatever was laying around their master's house. I mean, you know, keyboards, flutes, all these European instruments, but also, very importantly, they would just play these rhythms on anything they could find, like spoons and jugs and washboards and their own bodies. And I think that has a lot of influence in secular music, is because secular music is kind of seen as almost informal compared to sacred, and when you have instruments like spoons or jugs and stuff, I think it was kind of the start of all of that. And I mean, still great music came from that. And so, yeah, it caused them to look at different instruments other than drums to get the sounds that they were banned to create.
Yeah. So, just to kind of compare, there were 3 different kinds of songs that the slaves would sing. There were, of course, the religious songs, which were sung a cappella and accompanied by hand clapping and foot stomping. So, like Sonali was saying, I mean, using your body as in a percussive manner. Work songs, which they sang out on the fields, and those were just involving the voices of the slaves, and it was actually a call and response. And there was something about that I read about how it would be like one group of the slaves, it would be crying, and so they eventually had to ban the call and response maneuver, just because it was so disruptive and powerful, and definitely showed rebellion towards the masters and all the white men. And then, of course, the recreational or secular songs, like Sonali said, they would use anything for percussion, you know, the axe, washboard, broomsticks, anything that was accessible, handy to them, which in turn produced a large range of tonal variety.
Yes, and thus, yeah. Also, I had in the previous video a hello, we're back. Overall, the topic of secular music during slavery was not very well known, and it's hard to find a lot of music from that time because it was banned eventually, and they were forced to, because the whites found out that, you know, they were using this music as rebellion and against them, they were forcing the slaves to sing music that they knew and they felt comfortable with, like Southern hymns, white people music of their time. But yeah, and so the only thing I can recommend of getting a feel of the secular music of that time would be to, look up African music, West African drumming, and to see that that's where this originated from, and to get a feel of how they really sang back then. Yeah.
Are you ready?
I wanna be ready. I wanna be